series that we have on the state of gender equality. This is brought to you by the Gender Impact Studies Center, GAISC, at the Impact and Policy Research Institute, in collaboration with Delhi Post News, GenDev Center for Research and Innovation, and CityMakers Mission International. Today, we have with us Seema Kulkarni ji, who's going to talk about the natural resources and women in India, challenges, impact, and the way forward amid COVID-19 pandemic. Seema Kulkarni ji is one of the founding members of Society for Promoting Participative Ecosystem Management, Pune, SOPPECOM in short. She is presently working as Senior Fellow in SOPPECOM, Pune, and coordinating the gender and rural livelihoods activities within the organization. She has coordinated various studies and programs around decentralization, gender and land, water and sanitation. She has published several articles, books, chapters around issues of gender, water, sanitation, and rural livelihoods. She also teaches a few courses on water and equity and gender and rural livelihoods in Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and Savitribai Phule Pune University, Pune. She's currently the National Facilitation Team member of Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, or Forum for Women Farmers' Rights, Makam. SOPPECOM is a state anchor for Makam and also works as a co-secretariat at the national level. Seema ji has been associated with Stree Mukti Sangatana, the movement for rights of single women in Western Maharashtra, and is actively involved in the coalition of women's groups in Maharashtra, Stree Mukti Andolan Sampark Samiti. So, Seema ji, we move over to you to talk about some very important issues, and how the impact on natural resources has been creating problems, with regard to women, and of course, in terms of in the today's scenario. So over to you, Seema ji, and then we'll have discussions. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Indu ji, and thank you, IMPRI, for inviting me for this very interesting topic. And I'm really privileged to be here and share some of my own thoughts, and also the cumulative knowledge earned over a process of several years of activism and work with different women's collectives and groups across India. What I plan to do is make my points, let's say, in the next 20 to 25 minutes. And probably after that, we could have either questions or comments, either way that we would like to proceed. So let me quickly begin with discussing some of the broad contours of the debates on gender and environment before I place some of the key questions around gender gaps and what are the barriers and what could possibly be the ways forward. So what you see as the gender and environment thinking broadly, and this is globally, is broadly, I would say, there have been two areas that have dominated this discourse. The first, which was, of course, in the early part of the gender environment thinking, which highlighted the gender blindness in policies, programs at the global level. So it was why women are not part of some of the policies and programs around natural resources and environment. But of course, there was an emerging critique of not just looking at integrating women, but also trying to understand through the lens of relational perspectives, which in fact tried to highlight the dynamics of power across genders. And this was in terms of access to resources, control over resources, and also decision-making space with reference to natural resource management. So in a way, this was, I would say, a step, moving a step forward from looking at why women are not there to trying to understand the dynamics, the social relations, and the power relations that in fact is the barrier for the huge gender gap that you see in natural resource management in terms of control and access to resources as well. So what actually some of these debates tried to highlight very clearly was that experiences of environment are differentiated by gender. And this is very specifically through materially distinct daily work activities. So here clearly the emphasis was on a relationship between gender and environment as a result of the certain expected normatives. What are the responsibilities around resource use vis-a-vis men, women, and of course we should no longer be talking only about the binaries, but across genders. So clearly that there is a differentiated experience cutting across genders, and this is something that was very much highlighted. Uh, but what one saw in some of the early debates was that much of the thinking around gender and environment, as I said, was trying to build this construct of women as if it were a monolithic category. So in a way, uh, it had its own value because you were looking at this as a rallying point of how women are completely missed out from the thinking, policies, programs around environment and development in general. But however, there was a very strong critique that was emerging, and I would say, particularly from the southern countries, from uh, the South Asian, the Asian context, where there was a critique that kind of highlighted and, in a way, I would say, unsettled gender as an analytical category, showing how gender is not just constituted of women, but how it is constituted through other kinds of social differences as well. So, in the Indian context, caste is certainly an important category. It's an important form of social discrimination. There's ethnicity, there's class, of course, and each of these is deeply constituted through power relations. So I think what it tried to highlight very clearly is how relations with the environment are organized around social groupings, social forms of discrimination like caste, patriarchy, gender, and of course, ethnicity and other social differences. So I think this was a very major step ahead in thinking, which, as I said, it unsettled just using women, and it also unsettled this as one singular homogeneous category, but also sort of compelled us to look across different sections and the differentiated axis and relations with nature. Of course, the post 90s and, in a way, the opening up of the economy, which is also, the entire policies of neoliberalization have looked at nature also in a very different way. So what I would say is that there's a very concerted move towards capitalization of nature, and that in a way presents a whole new range of issues in the gender environment debate, which I will try to touch upon. But of course, why I thought it was important to bring in here was primarily because this also tells us that the gender gaps should not be only located in the context of the socio-cultural, but also need to be opened up in the larger context of development and the way the entire paradigm of development is changing, it's dynamic, and therefore our thinking also needs to be looking at and be conscious of some of these changes. Yes, could we move to the next slide, please? So just very quickly, historically, if one were to look at, how the gender and environment debates were sort of evolving and emerging, we clearly see that the early 70s, which was characterized by the wood fuel crisis, there was degradation of the environment, deforestation, and these were seen as really very critical issues in the 70s, highlighting the crisis of the degradation of the environment. The way the whole gender question was constructed in this period was clearly looking at women as victims, because women were seen in certain critical roles and responsibilities with reference to, let's say, collection of fuel, collection of water, fodder, particularly in the rural context, these were certainly very critical roles. So degradation of the environment also meant that, women, there would be increased time in and drudgery associated with trying to access these resources. So clearly then women were seen as the victims. But debates were emerging, debates were evolving, as we saw in the first slide, that one saw that in the 80s, there was clearly a different kind of a discourse that was emerging, which saw women in frontal roles, that women's leadership in environmental action was certainly recognized. And this was, of course, because of a large number of movements that were coming up in the Indian context. Chipko Andolan was, of course, a very, very significant movement, but across the globe, we saw a lot of environmental action with women in the frontal leadership roles. And these were in anti-atomic, anti-nuclear movements. So challenging in a way the different kinds of environmental hazards that were presented in different parts of the world. So there was also therefore a discourse that was emerging that whether as victims or whether as being in frontal roles, women did have a special relationship with nature. And this certainly had a huge impact on setting up of the development agendas. So you could clearly see that, whether it was global policies, programs, or even donor policies and programs, the development agendas that were set out clearly tried to engage with the question of women, with also being sort of parallelly, the terminology of gender had started coming into the entire gender and environment debates. This was also around the time, the 80s and later, that because of the leadership role and because of their presence in environmental action, the recognition of women as knowers and not just as victims was also clearly emerging. So their association with nature privileged them with knowledge that was very critical. So there was this body of discourse that was emerging, and one can clearly see the trajectory between the 70s, 80s, and later, the recognition of women as knowers and not just as victims. Yeah, can we move to the next slide, please? So what did these, learnings in a way, how did it really translate into programs? Across the globe, there were, different kinds of responses from the government, from civil society, where, of course, in the initial stage where you understood women as victims, there were clearly programs that tried to address some of those concerns. But the shift from understanding or recognizing women as also privileged knowers meant that they had to be integrated into environmental regeneration programs. Their participation had to be sought in very critical ways. But unfortunately, which as a lot of critiques emerged around some of these programs, was a very, very instrumentalist approach. So what I mean by an instrumentalist approach is that clearly women's knowledge and understanding was seen as only sufficient towards advancing some of the efficiency related concerns in development. So there was a critique that was strongly emerging around that. But what he unfortunately realized in the way the programs unfolded, particularly as part of the state response, was trying to engage women in activities around environmental regeneration. So we had these numerous soil building, tree plantation programs. We had the social forestry program that had actually emerged quite significantly in the 80s in India also, which in a way was not really valuing the knowledge that they had, but was just trying to integrate them in terms of activities and labor. And this also led to a second generation of critiques emerging, which spoke of how women's burden was increasing, by trying to integrate them into community programs as privileged knowers without really challenging the existing division of labor. So I think this was a very critical point that highlighted that without touching that, that larger social cultural frame, which in fact has patriarchy and caste at its center, by just trying to bring in women either into committees or into activities would not be sufficient. So therefore, despite the new understanding and the new recognition that came through these debates and discourses, we saw very little of it really translating into meaningful programs that would challenge the patriarchal context and would really bring women at the forefront of decision-making spaces and control over resources. So let's move to the next slide to see how, what have been these approaches in history. I will, of course, not go into the details of each of these approaches because a lot of literature is available on this. But I would just like to in a nutshell, try and capture how some of these approaches, whether it is women in development, which was more like an integrationist approach, where how do we bring women into development without really questioning or challenging the development paradigm. So in a way, the women in development and women and development approaches dominated much of the 70s and 80s across the globe, but definitely also in the Indian context. It was the gender and development approach which was trying to look at the entire question of gender and development through a more relational perspective. And as I said in my earlier slide, this relational perspective tried to recognize the power relations, the power dynamics across genders, and the way gender was, the way gender was organized by using different forms of social discrimination of caste, class, ethnicity, etc. So in a way, there was a shift, and at least the understanding had been advanced. But of course, not necessarily in the way that we would have liked to see it translated into programs and concrete policy outcomes. The women, environment, and development debates, in a way, were of course evolving debates from the 70s and even before, when the concerns clearly were emanating from the crisis, the way the development paradigm itself was moving ahead with a complete disregard for nature, that mastery over nature was actually the dominant thinking, and mastery over nature, achieving, ensuring that nature is controlled by humans, was in fact the paradigm that was increasingly being questioned by different uh, thinking in environmental discourses. And of course, feminist thinking around that was also evolving. And some of the trends that we see are ecofeminism. There are various strands of ecofeminism, of course, those that believe in the inherent relationship between women and nature, which in a way tried to, let us say, essentialize. In a way, when I say essentialize, I mean to say that, it is very naturally that women are related to environment and nature. Now, there was a critique that came up on this strand of thinking within ecofeminism, which said that, feminism has challenged determinism, challenged biological determinism. And how are we again going back to say that, women are naturally close to nature because of the certain roles that they perform? So there were critiques of that strand of ecofeminism emerging, but I believe that ecofeminism made a very central point in trying to critique the destruction of nature. And when we speak of nature, it also meant the destruction of women, and using women's bodies as also sites of these destructions. So in a way, there was a very close association of how a complete disregard for nature also meant that you were disregarding marginalized communities, you were disregarding women who performed a central role in actually regenerating and sustaining and protecting our environments. So it did make a very strong political statement at that time, and therefore I believe that ecofeminism in its various strands needs to be respected. But of course, there were critiques that emerged. Feminist environmentalism was a very strong statement that came from South Asia. Beena Agarwal has extensively written about it and has been, of course, one of the main proponents of this strand, where she with a lot of data and evidence shows how, particularly in the South Asian context, but more so in the Indian context, this relationship of women with nature is very centrally involved in the roles and responsibilities that come with the larger socio-cultural context that have in fact thrust some of these roles onto them. So the material relationship with nature to collect fuel, to collect fodder, to collect water is what uh, builds this relationship and knowledge of women with nature. And she therefore also goes on to say that this relationship is going to be varied, and it is not just women, but it is also the Adivasis and the marginalized communities who relate with nature are the ones who will have this special relationship. Feminist political ecology also tries to look at, of course, it draws on the political ecology framework and tries to bring in this whole context of how shifts in the environment, changes in the way development is actually taking place, needs to be located in the larger context of political economy, political ecology, and development in its broader sense. So it looks at, of course, control over resources, who controls these resources, and who is in the decision-making spaces around environment. And there's, of course, a whole body of work around feminist political ecology, which could be done at another time. Can we move on to the next slide? Yes, so I think these are just images that I wanted to share of how women were at, very much at the forefront of all of these struggles in environmental protection, environmental conservation, and also the knowledge that they carried around, seeking ways forward, what should be the development paradigm. And there are very interesting quotes from the whole Chipko Andolan, which Vandana Shiva has. She says that women who participate in and lead ecology movements in countries like India are not speaking merely as victims, but their voices are voices of liberation and transformation. The women's and ecology movements are therefore one and are primarily counter trends to patriarchal maldevelopment. I think it's a very important political statement that is made here with reference to CHIPCO, but of course, various other movements. Yeah. Can we move ahead? Yes, and I think this is an important work that I just wanted to highlight here. This is a work by Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva, which go beyond just the essential relationship between women and nature, but try to bring in the larger context of capitalism and capitalization of nature as well. Yeah, we can move. Let me move on to some of the issues that I wanted to highlight with reference to gender gaps and bring in the Indian context here. I think when we are looking at gender gaps in natural resources, there are 3 or 4 areas that we need to be focusing on. The first is differential access to resources, and resources here are, of course, a range of resources. So we're looking at land, forests, water, livestock, all of the resources that women are engaged in as part of their livelihoods and life. There is division of work that we should be looking at, that this is differential, that there is a division of labor which has certain associated roles and responsibilities. The third area is of knowledge. Whose knowledge is valued? and what are the dominant discourses and narratives around, whose knowledge and the question of gender here. And finally, participation in institutions of governance. Now, all of these gaps that we will look at in a little while, what they point to us is that because of these gaps, what happens is that there is a limited or a restricted access to resources, restricted access to decision-making opportunities of women. But what they also do is that they create a disparity in treatment, they create a disparity in opportunities between genders, which are in a way rooted in a very complex web of the socio-cultural, the legal, and the norms and the customs that actually organize societies. Now, these are also some of the barriers which we should look at, what could be the alternatives. And of course, they have deep impacts on women's lives, especially of those from the most marginalized communities. Yeah, we can move forward. I just want to quickly highlight some of the differential access to resources. Now, here we are looking at a comparative picture. This was of a study that we had done in a few villages in Maharashtra. And this is just one village that I would like to point here. So you look at two maps. These are village cadastral maps, which show us the first map. It's the same village. The first map looks at the caste and land ownership composition. And the second map looks at the land, the caste land and irrigation composition. If you try to compare, and what I would just like to bring to your notice is the green area in the second map, which shows access to water, it's irrigation. And in the first map, what you see as the yellow area is what is, land ownership, which belongs to the more, let's say, privileged castes. Yeah. So the open, what is categorized as the open categories in government official documents. But what you also see is that most of the SC, that, that pink color that you see in the land ownership, it's of course very, very marginal land holding that you see, that very light pink, and none of it almost has any irrigation. So what I'm trying to point to you here is that these are significant gaps. And unfortunately, we don't even have gender disaggregated data in land ownership, which we will see in our next slide. So this slide clearly shows the disproportionate access to resources, here looking specifically at land, agricultural land and irrigation. In the next slide, what we see is all that we have. Unfortunately, as I said, we do not have disaggregated data with reference to land ownership. What we use is the agricultural census, which is done once every 5 years and which only looks at operational holders who are not necessarily landowners. But even if we go by the operational holders data, what we clearly see is that the most recent 2015-16 data shows that not more than 14% of the entire operational holders are female operational holders. So 85% are male. And much of this, of course, India is a smallholder economy. So we already have 87% of all of these operational holders as small and marginal holders, and all of them also happen to be women. So all the women operational holders also fall in the category of small and marginal. So that gives us a picture of that huge gap here in terms of operational holdings. As we know, we rely on census data, which talks of cultivators. We have operational holders data from agricultural census, which talks of operational holders, but we really do not have any clear data that will tell us about ownership. What we know, however, from the from the census data and from various rounds of the national sample survey data is that there is a large presence of women in agriculture. So what we see is the huge gap between ownership or access to resources and the labor that is put in. Again, I would now like to take you to labor, which is largely unpaid labor. And again, I would like to bring to your notice the most recent data of the NSS, which is the periodic labor force survey, which shows, and over the years, what we've been seeing clearly is that women's employment is actually declining in agriculture. It's particularly sharp in rural areas, and what we see is that 22% of women, only 22% of women in the age group of 15 to 49 are in gainful employment. And this has seen a very clear decline. It was 31% in the earlier data set. So what do we see here? You know, what is the picture here? The picture clearly shows that there is a huge presence in agriculture, that agriculture is populated. We've been hearing terms like feminization of agriculture, which show that women are there. You know, 65% census shows, and various other data sets also show that in global food production, women are involved. But unfortunately, they are not paid for that work. So what we are seeing is that the shift of women's work in agriculture, women's work in rural areas is moving from paid employment to unpaid employment. And that is a very serious gender gap that we should be concerned about. Yes, we could move to the next one. So the there's a complete mismatch of ownership of resources, meaningful access to resources, meaningful access to paid employment opportunities, and the labor that is put in. Yeah. So we have, as a result of this poor access to ownership, we clearly see implications on a range of agricultural programs, a range of programs that are associated with natural resource management. So whether it's water, whether it's agriculture, whether it's in forest management, we see that increasingly women will therefore not have access to various inputs. So in agriculture, the example of seed, credit, extension services, the Kisan credit card. So all of these are also therefore entitlements that they are deprived of. Yes, we could move on to the next one, please. So very quickly, what we see is access to wages, credit, and budgetary allocations. These are the huge gap areas when it comes to natural resources. You have the slide before you, so I won't read it out for you. The points to be highlighted is that despite their participation in agriculture, what we see is that the female hourly wage rates in agriculture vary from 50 to 75% of male rates. This is with reference to agriculture. What we are seeing in agriculture related labor, particularly, I can give you an example of sugarcane cutting women who often work, I mean, cane cutting and much of migrant labor that works as couples. We see the labor of women completely invisibilized. So they are not even handed any wages. So all of the wages are handed over to the male, and there is a complete invisibilization of women as wage workers. And that is something that we should be certainly concerned about. Access to credit, women are simply not seen as credit worthy. So all that we see in programmatic form is to create self-help groups, make women self-employed, so that they are in a way moving out of the formal credit system. And I think we should be concerned about that because that already puts them in a position of complete vulnerability. We are increasingly seeing the rise of microfinance and of the exploitative kind. I know microfinance can be also have very positive outcomes, but we are seeing microfinance coming in a big way, approaching vulnerable sections. Women are very much part of that. So why can't we create formal access to credit institutions for women is also something that we should be looking at. And finally, in this point, the gender responsive budgeting. We still do not have any well conceptualized gender responsive budgeting in the area of natural resources. Unfortunately, it is only limited to the question of violence, ICDS, and that too extremely limited. It's not as if, that's a very great basket, but in the areas of agriculture, in the areas of water, forests, we do not have any strong gender responsive budgeting, which is also the reason why closing the gender gaps has become increasingly difficult. Yes, we can move. I think I should be winding up in the next 10 minutes, right? Uh,
Yeah, sure.
yeah. So I'll just quickly touch upon the division of work. I have already spoken about it. So let me quickly just highlight this point that, we are looking at women's labor, which is, as I have already mentioned, it's in this continuum of paid, underpaid, and unpaid. So a lot of work around natural resource management is very much in the realm of women's work. It is also in the realm of the marginalized communities, but much more so for women among these communities. And why is it also increasing? I think that's something that I would like to bring to your notice, because we are looking at a constant change in the way development also is being perceived. So why are we seeing more numbers of farm suicides? Why is there more agrarian distress? Why are people moving into urban areas in search of work that is not even decent, and where does it then leave the women? So we are increasingly seeing that agrarian distress, depletion, and degradation of resources has meant that the burden on women's unpaid work has risen manifold. So we are seeing that they are engaged in subsistence agriculture, despite the Har Ghar Mein Jal and these kind of slogans, we see women are engaged in water collection. Increasingly, the number of hours and the energy put in by them is increasing. So we could move to the next slide. Then this entire area of knowledge, which is also the reason why, unless we address this, we are not going to move ahead in closing of the gender gaps. So clearly, knowledge of those who are connected with these natural resources because of the roles and responsibilities is not valued. I mean, we simply are not, accommodative of the fact that there could be diverse ways of knowing and engaging with nature, and that is completely ignored. So we have these dominant narratives of what is the knowledge that should be valued. So there is the disciplines, the dominant kind of disciplines that are valued, the technocentrism that is valued over the knowledges of people who are directly associated with nature and natural resources. And I think this is something that we should take into consideration. Moving ahead on the next slide. Yeah. And then you come to institutions, where also we clearly see that there are, significant gaps. So I'm just naming a few here, where, you have the agricultural cooperatives, you have forest committees, water institutions. So both at the community level, where at least there is some talk about quotas and reservations for women. But even there, we do not see the presence of women in the manner that we would like to see. So quotas are simply not sufficient. You have to move towards effective participation. And as Beena Agarwal says in her work, that we are looking at a ladder of participation. So we cannot be just happy with their presence and numbers in committees, which is important. But what are the concrete and conscious efforts made by the state, where finances are put in, where there are budgetary allocations to ensure effective and informed participation of women across marginalized communities into planning around their resources? The picture at the micro level, of course, but even at the meso and micro level, we find that there is a huge gap. The studies that we did with women water professionals showed us that participation of women as bureaucrats in the water departments was really very abysmal. So we need to also be thinking about the composition of the meso and macro level institutions. Yes, we could move ahead. So, of course, there are deep-seated impacts of these gender gaps. So we see a lot of reallocation of work. And by reallocation of work, I mean that less and less women can be engaged in productive work because of the large amount of work that has to be, in fact, moving into the unpaid area. So as I said, degradation of resources, mail out migration, farm suicides are reasons why women are forced to engage more and more into unpaid work related to natural resources. So investments really need to go in there. There is a further reduced asset ownership among marginalized communities, as we are seeing large amount numbers of displacement and dispossessment. We are also seeing increased violence against women and marginalized social groups. I can give you numerous examples. We have caste conflicts that are emerging as a result of lack of water. We also have witch hunts against women who are trying to claim their rights over land. There is a larger impact on the health and well-being. And of course, we've seen other social impacts like girl children moving out of schools as a result of more engagement in trying to access the depleted natural resources. The other area that I've already spoken of is the way women are getting caught in the spiral of debts, and this is largely the area of microfinance that we are increasingly seeing. Yes, we could move ahead, please. Yeah, I think I've discussed this. So overall, what it points to is that there is a disruption in the lives and livelihoods of the marginalized communities, with women really taking a whole lot of the brunt of it. Yes, we could move on to the next slide, please. We could move on to the next slide also. So let's look at the barriers, to close these gaps. So if one needs to understand these barriers in order to move forward. And what we see is that these barriers clearly are predominantly reinforcing the dominant narratives, both around development and gender. So how do you look at women? How do you look at marginalized communities? And what are our notions of development? Very much frame the larger discourse, and therefore remain the barriers for any kind of advancement to close gender gaps. So I would just put these in 3 or 4 points. The thing about closing gender gaps is not simply about looking at the socio-cultural, because that's very often a solution that is offered by various sectors. For example, I constantly engage with the water sector, and we are often told that all of that is the socio-cultural. Don't bring that into the way the sector is developing. So I think it is here that we need to really question the paradigm, the extractive model of development that is in fact basing itself on the capitalization of nature. The entire monocultures, the chemical intensive models, which are in fact dispossessing the poor and the marginalized communities. So there is that entire barrier that also needs to be addressed. And of course, there is that barrier of patriarchy, caste, and capital, and the way it adapts and accommodates to ensure that there is a sustained control over resources of the powerful. So violence is used over women. So we know of gender-based violence, but violence is also used on marginalized communities to ensure the subjugation and exploitation and to reinforce these inequalities. So I think unless we are able to get to some of these substantive questions, we really will not be able to move forward. Yes, next please. So there have been numerous responses from both the state and from communities. We've seen women at the forefront of these struggles. They're protecting resources, they're protecting their land and water from being grabbed. They're using their own knowledges and ways of knowing and doing things to ensure that their livelihoods are sustained. But they also have to diversify in numerous ways. So in fact, we're looking at increased diversification of the livelihood portfolio, but that is actually indicative of the precarious nature of their livelihoods. So I think the responses are more of survival and not really responses that have unless the state intervenes and the state is actually able to mediate and clearly make investments to protect these communities, to ensure social and economic protection, I do not think that these responses will always remain in that survival category. So, of course, the state clearly has provided only inadequate and I would say also counterproductive responses. As far as gender is concerned, there is very little thinking and analysis of the changing gender relations. There is very little thinking of trying to look at how inequalities could be transformed. You have to move towards a transformative agenda and not just trying to say, okay, har ghar tak jal, but also how can that possibly and potentially challenge the broader inequalities. Yes, we could move to the next one, please. So finally, I mean, what could be the pathways for change? We have to look at hope, and I think there is enough knowledge amongst communities, amongst women's collectives, to lead that pathway, to lead that and create that kind of a pathway. But there has to be an integrated, broader ecosystem-based approach to development, which has a commitment to gender and social justice. There also have to be policies in natural resources across sectors that would be that would need to be formulated in ecologically sound and socially just ways. And moving on to my last point, that there has to be primarily a recognition of women across marginalized communities as workers, as farmers, valuing their knowledge, valuing and recognizing their work, both in the spheres of production and social reproduction. So I think here, this entire realm of unpaid work will have to be valued. What also needs to be done is altering the property regime. So we have to start talking about redistribution. We have to start talking about land reforms and all kinds of reforms that will ensure advancing the rights and entitlements of not just women, but across marginalized communities and disenfranchised communities. So social and economic protection is an important part of that, but also a complete re-envisaging of that development paradigm and ensuring that there is a much more participatory and engaged involvement of the communities. So I think what we need to start valuing is work, what we need to start valuing is knowledge, and what finally we need to start looking at is really altering these property regimes and ensuring access to entitlements. And none of this would be possible unless there is a well-formulated roadmap for transformative financing. I think that is going to be really very critical in making this transition. So I'll stop here, and I'm really sorry for overstepping on time, but I do hope that this was useful. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. Well, I must say, in fact, Seema ji, it was a very fascinating discussion. It's a very fascinating point that you raised. And I suppose, you made the topic really interesting with the permutations and combinations. And I think you brought in the richness of the discourse by also bringing the theories and its application, and also identifying the gaps and all in the particular area as such, And I think you surely spoke about not seeing women as victims, but also as knowers and also doers, and how the environmental regeneration program and all, would lead to efficiency. I think this was something important you mentioned. And then I like the fact that for you, when you spoke about we, it was women for the environment, that's like it's a collective, it's a collective of women together. And I think, and what be also interesting is like, maybe in your own practice and all, I think how you've gone about doing some of this in the field, or how some of the organizations have gone about building women's networks and collectives, really important to share also, because time was limited, you couldn't share. And also I like the way you did the breakup of the various theories and all, And I think this is a discourse that we really had about women in development, gender and development, and women environment for, development. I think important. And then I think also about ecofeminism and the various strands of ecofeminism, I think it brings in a very important dimension where I think the movement was from mastery over nature is where we come to terms with nature as something which actually enhances the entire community. So I think which is what I think, the work that's gone on about. And in fact, I had the good fortune of working with Vandana Shiva, with Navdanya and Research Foundation for Technology and Ecology. And so I understand the terms that you have been using, and I suppose against the monoculture, we talk about biodiversity as such. And, also I know you spoke about fertilizers and all those things, which in a way has destroyed actually the movement from agriculture to agribusiness has also destroyed much of the work. So I think the cultural element of agriculture has been missing, and how the cash crops have come in and have actually taken away women from agriculture, because the most cash crops we have, I think more of women will be removed from agriculture, and men will be into agribusinesses. So I think the models that we have followed, whether it's biotech and all that, we have brought in technology which have also, in a way, thrown women out of the discourse of being farmers and all. So I think there's also been how the technology I think uptake by a society has also been very patriarchal. I think so that I think you have insinuated towards that. So I would say maybe you can also discuss that when you come in later. And I think you brought in this issue of how women have been removed from ownership, and how they have been made into a labor, and then labor is also where they are paid very less compared to men, and much of the labor now goes into unpaid labor and underpaid labor. I think it's a very important dimension you brought in, and how even the women's labor is invisibilized. Like when you talk about farmers, like I still remember even the Krishi Darshan and all program that used to happen, they used normally say, "Bhai, hamare krishak bhai sune, aapko kya karna hai?" The entire agriculture extension program of the government of India for many years only focused on men. They never realized that actually much of agriculture is done by women as well. So I think that they are, so the laboring community, and in terms of hours and all that, women have been laboring much more than men as such. I think this has been kind of an invisibilized, like patriarchy has done a damage, not only in terms of social cultural things, but also in the economic domain. When women come out, I think it's also invisibilized their existence, which I think has to be the detriment of I think the entire environment debate and all. And I think you beautifully brought in how the institutions that have come up about also, whether it's agriculture cooperatives, forest committees, water institutions, and all the various micro, meso, and macro, institutions. I think somewhere what happens is, I've also seen with our own work with the homeless people as such in the cities and all, that people go into easy routes, like working with men, okay, fine, they're comfortable. But working with women actually requires a lot of skills. It doesn't come in easy. And most of our own development-centric norms have been patriarchal. So that's the reason why women continue to be ignored from all these, larger domains of development and all. And I think, you spoke about extractive model of development, which I think is what monoculture and cash crops and all is all about. And I think in terms of responses you have mentioned, yes, I do feel that, I think the transformative agenda, as you mentioned, is key to it. And I think at the end, when you come about talking about, altering the, property regime, and then how socio-economic and then also the political and economic dimensions have to be looked into, and how I think you bring in the dimension of how the, how caste, class, gender, and ethnicity are the most important categories, which actually, in a way, individually and collectively, oppress women. So I think it's a very interesting perspective, and I would say that, I haven't heard for long such a rich perspective that he brought in. And, as I open it for friends from IMPRI to come in, Arjun and Simi and other friends, I'll come back later again. Thank you for a very informed, discussion, informed presentation you made. And, well, we are indebted to what you said, Thank you. So we can have your questions and inputs and all, Arjun and Simi and other friends, huh?
Yes. Thank you, ma'am, for such a wonderful presentation. Really, taking time was very necessary, and you rightly tried to squeeze your presentation. It was very insightful. Let me first congratulate you for putting across so many dimensions and such a clear presentation, really. Some of the things which ma'am has rightly, I will not go very much in nuances. Professor Indu Prakash can really take some of them. But really, I will just add from where Sir left, that ma'am is really highlighting the role of transforming finances. So ma'am, and really looking into the wages and the in excess, and missing the precarious condition in agriculture and resources, ma'am, is has really highlighting in water and agriculture. So ma'am, can you also stress a little bit more on what are the pathways toward this transforming finances? Also related to it, most of the question really I have taken from your last slide, especially looking into the way ahead. What in your view, ma'am, are the reforms which also you are suggesting that we really have to take? Really, so not very meta, but ma'am, if you can also suggest from your groundwork that what will be those small steps that can be taken, which can have impact, if taken also by, let us say, in Bihar, Jharkhand, what are the essential reforms which can be taken at, especially at the local level, be it property. We also have something, Swayam, this portal launch for property, now IT and other things, cadastral mapping and many things, ma'am, have also tried really to show. So what can also be done from those point of view now, which are possible? And ma'am has really touched upon on Har Ghar Nal Jal, this scheme. We also had that for toilet and financial inclusion, Jan Dhan Yojana, many of these things coming, but really that is not translating other than the macro numbers, 8 crore, 10 crores. And that there is exclusion, of course, as ma'am is also showing from those cadastral maps, and so plethora of works of over the decades. So what can be the feasible bridging that gap? And one just the last thing I wanted to, what can be the role of agency, and what can effective agency can be? We have something called self-help group program, around 70 lakhs SHGs, 6, 7, 8 crore, more members, mostly on papers, not effective ones. So what are those measures which can lead to an empowered, gender responsive and society where all these things are plugged from the ground level as well? Thank you, ma'am. I think you can choose to take questions, but really reflect upon as you seem fit. Yes, ma'am, over to you.
How much time do we have? Because I don't want to, obviously.
Ma'am, I think we have 10 minutes. Indu,
Yeah. Please.
if Indu sir also have to add anything, we can extend.
Yeah. But I think surely we have time until you feel satisfied by answering all that. We have that much time. Don't worry that.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Induji, and thank you, Arjunji also. It was really nice being here, and of course, the way you have sort of reiterated and articulated some of the points. Just going straight to some of the questions. I think the first question was with reference to transformative financing. And this is something that really there is a serious need to move into, is what many of us who are working on issues of natural resources, agriculture, water sector are actively engaging with our own state budget processes. But also at the national level, there is a feminist policy collective, and there is also Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, which is trying to engage with what do we mean when we say that there has to be transformative financing. So some of the immediate concerns are linked to the way gender budgets actually are worked in, when the process of budgeting does take place. So it is extremely limited, but nonetheless, we feel that we need to begin with an engagement there. So let's say, for example, in agriculture, agriculture has forever said that 30% budgetary allocation is for women. We have never seen any outcome budgets. So for example, we don't know what happens to that 30% that is dedicated in the name of women. Some studies done in some states by budget groups, in Rajasthan, for example, the budget group there clearly showed that despite this 30% allocation, not more than 9 to 10% of the budget allocated for women is actually used for women. So why? Of course, one needs to be constantly asking this question. And clearly then it emerges that it is so directly linked to also your ownership to resources. So who are women farmers? You know, that entire question of if you own land, you have access to various programs and entitlements. So clearly that exercise showed that if you are to avail that 30%, you also therefore need to have ownership and titles to resources. In Maharashtra, we only now, unfortunately, have started with a gender budget, but it is completely silent on agriculture. It is completely silent on water. Uh, uh, in fact, so the nature of the budget in agriculture, for example, is drip irrigation sets. Okay, so that's one kind of a budget. Now, again, it's totally tied to your land ownership. Seed and other agricultural inputs, of course, if you belong to a landholding family and if you are cultivating, you can still have access to. But none of these schemes or programs are really tailored to understand the kind of agriculture or activities that women are engaged in. So we would say that, when we say transformating financing, it is moving from the way the entire gender responsive budgeting is done, where ministries come in at a later stage. Okay, so you have a budget for agriculture which has already been done. And then because at the national level, you have to ensure that there are some gender budget allocations to be made, certain figures would simply be allocated without any serious thought given into understanding the gaps to actually access those schemes. Yeah, so that's where we talk about clear gender gaps. That if that gender budgeting process were to start with participation of women's groups or people who are working in this sector, probably the prioritization could have been done in a completely different way. So, for example, we have a law which talks of equal property rights to girls and to daughters and sons, right? But there is no conscious effort, no mechanisms, no budgets allocated to ensure that that law is implemented. Or we have excellent examples from, let's say, Kerala, where the Kudumbashri has shown that, women's collectives, in the absence of land titles, there are also these parallel processes that could happen where women's collectives or even or women-led FPOs, the farmer producer organizations, could yield excellent results. But then they need a lot of hand-holding, they need financial supports, they need inputs of very, very critical kinds that will ensure that they are able to take those processes forward. So these are, there's a complete blindness, I would say, into the thinking that happens when gender budgeting. So it's just a very tokenistic kind of an activity. And by transformative, we would certainly mean that, you're not only allocating money to say that if you install a tap in the house, it's a gender budget. That's the way it's being conceived right now. But what would that mean in terms, let's say, of a change in control over resources or decision-making spaces, or even for that matter, challenging the existing division of labor, which is extremely patriarchal. So are we not going to even open those discourses? Do we constantly move with that narrative of woman as, being in the roles that she is in? So transformative financing also calls for transformative policies and program processes. They have to go hand in hand. Yeah, so that was one point. Looking at, specifically what needs to be done. I think I would say that these are all linked, my first answer. So at the ground level, there are multiple things that we, have been proposing and which certainly are within, could also be framed within some of the current schemes and programs that we have. Just to give one example, which I've also put up in my slide, if you're looking at the NREGA program, the MNREGA, what we are seeing is that why can't we, especially, I mean, it's also a program which talks about employment opportunities for women. It's really one program that has in fact opened up those kind of opportunities. But why can't we use Narega the way it was? Again, I would like to cite the example of Kerala, where a convergence of various ministries, and various, so it was agriculture, it was the rural development, it was the Narega programs coming together that actually helped build the assets for women. So on my land, I have a collective, but I also use that employment program so that I have wages and I'm simultaneously creating assets for myself. Now, these are, there are numerous such programs which I can cite. If there is a concerted effort to make a plan, and for us as civil society to also use those programs in creative ways to ensure that we are able to reduce the gender gaps. So, I mean, as I said, women's collectives need to be promoted in a strong way. This is in forest, timber forest produce. Actually, the COVID context brought up many challenges where women were simply not able to market. So, that's also an area that we've been actively talking about, where you launch a scheme like the minimum support price scheme. You also, increase its scope from just say rice and wheat to include various other cereals and the other millets, etc. But you do not have a mechanism to ensure that those are sourced. And these are the crops that are grown by women farmers and other marginal farmers. So how do we ensure steps to use these schemes in a creative manner is also something I think that will be important. And there are a number of examples. When it comes to agency, SHGs also, again, I would like to give an example of a very interesting example from both Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, where they've used the SHG to actually procure, and also now increasingly in Odisha, where the millets program is being launched, where you are procuring from the women farmers through the SHGs and also locally distributing that food. So in a way, you are actually tying up the procurement and the food distribution at the local level through the agencies such as the SHG. So on the one hand, you have nutritious food and nutrition security centered agriculture, but also an expanded food system where you are able to move towards more nutrition. So I think there are creative ways in which one could engage to actually make some of these things both ecologically sound, but also empowering for women and other marginalized communities. And finally, I completely agree, Induji, with your analysis that how the technocentric and extractivist model has in fact displaced women from their roles. And increasingly, we are seeing this decline in employment because either machines have replaced or, I mean, their knowledges are not valued. Their knowledge about seed protection, the knowledge of cultivating, certain crops in certain ways. So you have, you just have the multinational person coming and telling you when to sow, how to sow, what to put, when to put, which completely sort of, undermines that, the tremendous amount of knowledge that women and I would say marginalized communities did have. So obviously this paradigm itself needs to be challenged, which will allow for diverse ways of knowing and practicing engagement with natural resources. And I am completely with you on that point. And in small but definitive ways, women are at the forefront. I didn't go into details of those struggles, but everywhere, whether it is a fight against SEZs, whether it is the Narmada Andolan, whether it is the resistance against Vedanta, everywhere you will find women at the forefront because they see the meaning and the value attached to natural resources. So it's not anything which is natural, but it's something which is, in a way, I would say, thrust upon them because of the distress. And these are the only now resources remaining that need to be protected. And women see its value, and therefore they are at the forefront. Despite the fact that after waging those battles, winning those struggles, we have seen that women have not gained control over resources. So we have the Bihar amazing story of how women, fought for land titles, for the disenfranchised community, but in the end, women did not have those titles. So I think we need to be mindful of the fact that if you are waging those battles, you also need to have very clear entitlements on those resources, either as collectives or as individuals. So it's not enough to just say we are against this development paradigm, but it's also
Yes.
important to say that very conscious and concerted efforts would be made to challenge and, as we say, smash that prison of patriarchy and caste if one were to move towards a socially just society.
Yeah,
I'll stop there, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Seema ji, for answering those questions. There are some questions also in the question and answer, section. I'll read out the questions. I think there are two, and then I'll chat also. I think it's important. Your sharing was making me deeply reflective. It's by an anonymous attendee saying your sharing was making me deeply reflective and recall many personal memories as well. One aspect I would like to bring attention to in the context of violence and social justice is girl children are losing access to education when facing communal violence. For example, a marginalized Muslim girl child who from a social standing that gave her access to education prior to an instance of genocide, violence, right, then pushed into a place where she became part of a group traveling, walking on foot to fetch water in a settlement away from city to save their lives too. So this aspect want to call more attention to, as much as there is within capitalist structures of social development, how many are being pushed into resourcelessness, lack of it, and these struggles are heartbreaking and real too. You have referred to in your presentation in a broad way, but wanted to share this specific anecdote and invite any responses you may have on this aspect, both moderator and speaker. And the other point was, other thing I noticed, especially within patriarchal structure, as mentioned by the by moderator too wonderfully, working with women requires skill was brought up. Some men I find feel threatened within social work and gender justice acknowledging structures. So they do not want to see women in decision-making positions. And it's a strange space because these are also men that speak a certain gender justice, knowing knowledge, knowing language that require that nature of violence also becomes important to acknowledge and work towards making spaces equal for women, acknowledge their work, make unpaid work paid, and unpaid labor be acknowledged and paid too. So that was this point. And I think in chat, we had this point from Lynn Henry saying, thank you. This is an engaging conversation to listen to and raise so many more questions for oneself, a needed conversation and a marker to acknowledge many aspects that require further work on in terms of securing rights of women and marginalized genders, persons too. So Seema ji, if you want to add something to what they've said. Any response you have to for that?
Yeah, no, I think I completely share that point, and that anecdote only substantiates what I've been saying. And
Yeah.
Absolutely, I mean, constant reminder that we are not only we cannot only look at either capitalism or patriarchy and caste, as isolated. They are completely hand in hand. And as we have seen, as I've also mentioned in my slide, I could not talk about it for longer, but how capitalism, which we think as, very liberal in that sense, we have always thought that capitalism would liberate us from all these social inequalities. I mean, it's only profit that matters, but how that is not so. I think time and again, capitalism has shown us that it will constantly accommodate so will patriarchy and caste to ensure the status quo, ensure that there is control over the most powerful and the dominant communities. So whether it is caste, the dominant caste, whether it is the men from these dominant castes, so there always will be that power dynamics, and each of these class, caste, and patriarchy are constantly going to adapt and accommodate to suit each other. So I think that is a very central point, that you're, when you are creating a counter a discourse, that counter discourse will have to bring in all of these together. You cannot only say that, when we it's not only a question of women being on committees, or it's not only a question of women having individual land titles. I would not stop there. We don't want to individuate resources.
Yes.
What we're talking of is a completely different paradigm, which looks at collectivization, cooperatization, and not corporatization, the way it is moving forward. I think it's it's only within that larger paradigm, which is a non-capitalist, I would say non-corporate paradigm, that we are going to find our answers. So I completely agree with you that all these axes of differentiation, whether it's religion, you spoke of that example of the Muslim girl. We have seen that in a Muslim community in Mumbai, where how it was completely marginalized from a water program simply because they belong to a certain community. So yes to that, and absolutely.
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you, Seema ji, I think, for answering all this so well. And I surely personally feel that, the men are scared of women collectivizing for the simple reason that they know that there'll be answer to all problems. And even the small and marginal handholding that we have, if women had the control, they would collectivize and do the farming together and involve the indigenous practices as such, which would increase agricultural produce, have more organic farming and all those things, a rebuttal to the cash crop economy as such. I think, so there's a paradigm that we all have, and maybe I think the time has come to do some deep search and deep thinking on the parameters that you have mentioned. And of course, I think the transformative budgeting that you talk about, financing and all that talk about is so key, to this. And I think you made this discussion on natural resources and women in India so interesting, and that you brought in the various challenges that everybody faces. And one answer to it is that in greater involvement of women and greater recognition of women's participation in these activities is key to, I think, further development. So with that, I would hand over to friends in IMPRI, Arjun and others, to take over now. Arjun?
Sir, I am here, but we can. I really have many things to converse with ma'am. Such a beautiful presentation, especially on marginalized, tribal and minority women. Ma'am is really highlighting those are the marginalized, also in agriculture or the invisible worker. But in the interest of, we will have ma'am again on other issues, especially on water and agriculture work. So thank you. I would just say thank you. And in this, sir, why don't officially you just propose a vote of thanks? Just to, yes, Seema, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, everybody. I think thanks a lot, IMPRI team, and thanks a lot all the participants for this important conversation we had. And we look forward to more engaging conversations with Seema ji. So thank you for joining us for this very interesting series that we've had. So all the best and Zindabad to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Zindabad. God bless. Thank you.